This is the final broadcast from the crew, a moment steeped in mystery and unease. Position logged, weather fine, nothing to report. A routine Thursday on a routine crossing. That was March 4th, 1998. 1 week later, on March 11th, a search plane found the vessel circling in open water, engines running, course set, navigation lights on. No distress call had ever been sent. No lifeboat had been launched. Every single person aboard had simply stopped existing while the ship kept doing its job. The ship they were sailing had a reputation, one the company never disclosed to the crew. Her name is worth remembering because the paper trail on her is long and it is not flattering. A refitted cargo carrier, 23 years old, bought cheap and patched together by whichever yard bid lowest. Her engine room had gone dark 3 times in the previous 2 years, each fix signed off as permanent. Twice, crew members had been injured on deck. Once, a winch cable snapped and left a deckhand with a broken collarbone. Nobody who knew the ship questioned why she kept getting work. She was the option that fit the budget, and budgets do not read incident reports. The route they were assigned had been avoided by other ships for 3 years. That route cut through a remote stretch of the South Pacific, where the charts show nothing but open water and the currents run wrong. Not wrong in the way that delays you, wrong in the way that pulls you off track and gives nothing back. In the mid-90s, 4 vessels filed through that corridor, and 4 transmissions went quiet in the same span of weeks. Search efforts covered thousands of square miles and turned up nothing. No wreckage, no debris, no signal. Mapping agencies quietly moved the lane in 1996, rerouting commercial traffic 200 miles to the east and calling it a navigational adjustment. The company that owned this ship never altered their course. The crew roster included someone who shouldn't have been there. The name on the roster arrived 3 days before departure, a last-minute replacement for a deckhand who'd quit over a family emergency. Maritime staffing moved fast in the 90s. A phone call, a faxed resume, a berth. Nobody ran the background check until it was too late. His employment history was 4 pages of coastal freighters, a decade of terminals from Galveston to Valparaiso. 3 of those companies didn't exist. 2 others had no record of anyone by that name. The gaps between jobs were simply not there, filled with dates that overlapped nothing and led nowhere. On paper, he'd served with a set of qualifications he'd never earned, certificates stamped by an inspector who'd retired 14 years earlier. The purser flagged it, wrote a note in the margin, and never followed up. The ship sailed with all hands accounted for, and one man simply unaccounted for. What he told the captain in private was never recorded, but the captain changed the route immediately after. Satellite ping data reconstructs the turn almost to the minute. 14 hours out of port, the vessel bent south, 80 nautical miles off the agreed lane, aiming at a stretch of ocean charts marked simply as deep water. An atoll sits there, low and unmapped, home to nothing, for 100 miles in any direction. The ship held that heading for 9 hours and never once transmitted a course alteration. No waypoint update, no radio chatter, no AIS deviation logged. Whatever the captain had decided, he had decided not to tell the shipping office. Investigators later matched the timing against weather logs. The sea was calm, visibility clear, no mechanical casualty recorded in the engine log. There was no storm to blame, no cargo shift, no reason on paper for a fully loaded freighter to leave its lane for an island that wasn't on any chart. The first sign something was wrong came from a passing tanker. The tanker's third mate was on the bridge as dawn broke, and the freighter was where no ship should have been, sitting in slow, lazy circles, a full knot of drift under no engine at all. He watched for 20 minutes with binoculars. Not one figure moved on the deck. They raised the vessel on VHF, 4 separate channels, then the emergency band. Silence came back, not static, but the flat quiet of a radio keyed off. The tanker circled once at 2 miles, close enough to see a scupper hanging loose and a hatch cover ajar, and then the rules took over. You log it, you note the position, you keep your schedule. The report went into the shipping database with a time, a bearing, and a description of a ship that appeared crude and yet empty. By the time the words reached the Coast Guard, 11 hours had already passed on a vessel that was still turning the same slow circle. No lights, no wake, nobody. When the Coast Guard reached it 16 hours later, the scene made no sense. The boarding party came over the rail expecting to find someone. They found a ship fully alive, in every way but one. The engines were running, warm to the touch. Every light on the vessel was on, from the masthead down to the stern. In the galley, a pot sat on the stove, with food still steaming, set for one. Coffee had gone cold in a cup at the mess table. Personal belongings lay exactly where you'd leave them. A jacket over a chair, a wallet on a bunk, boots side by side. Nothing was tossed, nothing was disturbed, nothing was missing. Then the count began. Lifeboats were all in their davits, lashed tight, never launched. Nobody had tried to abandon ship, and nobody had gotten off. The wheelhouse had the autopilot engaged. The course a slow, patient circle laid in by hand. They searched every compartment, every hold, every locker, calling out names into empty rooms. There was no one aboard. There never had been, for hours. And when they finally reached the bridge, opened the logbook, the last thing anyone wanted to see was there. The ship's log stopped mid-sentence. The final entry in the log reads like the least remarkable page in the whole book. Weather, clear. Visibility, good. Barometer, steady. The captain had written a routine note about an unusual current, something he'd felt through the hull, a pull he'd never felt on a run like this, and then nothing. That sentence about the current is simply unfinished. The pen's last stroke trails off the paper, the ink still wet enough to smear a finger across. Whatever happened, happened in the middle of writing. There is no second page, no addendum, no hurried add-on. Forensics put the handwriting under analysis, compared every line against the captain's own earlier entries. There's no tremor, no faster dash, no shortening of strokes, none of the tells that show up when someone is afraid. Whoever wrote that half sentence was calm. He simply stopped being there. That raised the only question that mattered, the one nobody wanted to ask out loud. Something had happened before the log the boarding party held, before the pen stopped moving, before the ship went silent. The radar had recorded something approaching the ship hours before the log ended. The radar tape is the kind of artifact that turns a mystery into a nightmare, because it doesn't drift or exaggerate, it just records. And what it recorded clocks in at a precise time, the same hour the captain's pen froze on that final line. A contact appears on the sweep from the southwest, closing on the ship. It's big, whatever it is, big enough to return a strong echo through the clutter. And it is slow, far slower than any merchant traffic in those lanes, slower than anything that should be out there at all. The blip pulls alongside the vessel and then holds position, dead steady, for 40 minutes. Is 40 minutes of the tape, one object refusing to drift, refusing to fall astern, ridiculously still beside a ship that was circling. Then it vanishes into the grain and is simply gone. The Coast Guard checked every harbor, every port authority, every log, up and down that coast. No vessel of any kind was in the area that night. No fishing boat, no freighter, no military patrol that anyone will admit to. The tape doesn't lie, and nobody on it was ever identified. The hull showed marks that shouldn't have been there. The marks ran along the starboard side, 3 of them, deep and parallel, sitting below the waterline, where barnacles and paint should have been ground clean. They weren't scars from a collision. A collision gouges and splinters. These scrapes were smooth, almost polished, as if something huge had pressed against the hull for a long time and then let go. Marine forensics found organic residue in the grooves and a pressure pattern that had bowed the plating inward, millimeter by millimeter, without punching through it. That kind of contact doesn't come from a passing object. It comes from sustained pressure, the kind you'd expect if something massive had held the ship in place. The paperwork called it inconclusive. The investigators, writing those reports, stopped joking on the way down to the cabins. Inside the crew quarters, investigators found something none of them were prepared for. The captain's quarters looked like a storm had gone through them. Drawers yanked out and dumped on the floor. A mirror shattered across the desk. Navigational charts torn into strips. Every page of the logbook was gone from its bindings. But that was all. The rest of the ship had no signs of struggle at all. No ransacked cabins, no overturned bunks, no scuff marks on the corridors. You don't trash a captain's office and leave the rest of the vessel untouched, unless the person who did it knew exactly what they were looking for. Forensics swabbed the paper cuts, the glass, the splintered drawer fronts. Not one usable print. Whoever was in that room had either worn gloves or wiped it down afterward, which takes time and a clear head. The crew would have been asleep below. Someone wanted them that way. And when investigators measured the torn charts against what was logged as missing, they noticed something. The pages the captain had destroyed were not random. The maps he destroyed were all of the same island. That island doesn't appear on any modern chart. No satellite imagery, no nautical record, nothing in the merchant databases. It just isn't there, and it wasn't there in 1952 either. In 1952, a hydrographic survey team logged it once, a small atoll sitting in open water, and flagged it for what the report called navigational anomalies. The survey report is 8 pages long. Page 3 is when the trouble starts. Equipment malfunctions, they wrote. Compasses drifting, radio bearings doubling back on themselves, chronometers skipping minutes at a time. Aboard a survey vessel, instruments failing in unison is not bad luck. It's a pattern. 10 days in, they abandoned the mission and never went back. And here is the part no one explains. The ship's logs from that week were sealed, not destroyed, sealed, which in maritime administration means a reason exists and someone decided you should never hear it. The last transmission from that 1952 team was never declassified. The transcript that leaked has the ring of a last message. The survey team described, in precise technical language, structural formations inconsistent with natural geology. Then, acoustic interference drowned out the rest. After that, nothing. Radio contact ceased. When military recovery found them 3 days later, the men were disoriented, sun-blistered, and unwilling to describe what they had seen. They filed no official report. They answered no questions. Everything they observed that week went to the sealed logs, which means someone in command read it first and decided the full account should not exist. Somewhere between the geological survey and the silence, something was buried so deep that even the survivors would not name it. Here is what we can date with certainty. The last transmission broke off on a Thursday afternoon. The ship was found a week later, drifting, empty. And it was in that exact window that the missing crew's families began receiving strange packages. 5 families, 5 unmarked parcels. Inside each one, personal items that had belonged to a member of the crew. A watch, a wedding ring, a child's crayon drawing, folded carefully around a seaman's bracelet. Nothing else, no note, no return address. The postmark was the detail that bothered people. Every package had been mailed from the same coastal town, 600 miles from the ship's last known position, the same day, almost the same hour. Some of the families kept the items on mantles, hoping they meant the men were alive and speaking through a proxy. The drawing was pinned to a refrigerator for years, because nobody could bring themselves to ask the obvious question: how would a stranger know exactly which objects to send, and to which doors? Then the shipping records were pulled, and the timeline collapsed. The postmark date was 3 days before the ship was found. Forensic examination dated the parcels to the week the crew was still aboard, not cached somewhere waiting to be sent, not held in a warehouse. Actually in transit. The packages moved through the postal system while the ship was still reporting routine positions. That narrows it to one uncomfortable scenario. Whatever sent those items knew the crew's personal belongings, knew their home addresses, and knew the ship would not surface again. A postal worker remembers the man who dropped the parcels off. Calm, unhurried, ordinary. He paid in cash and left. There is no record of how the items left the vessel. No mail was logged on the ship's manifest that week. The lockers, when they were eventually inspected, no longer held the watches, or the rings, or the drawing. Someone had gone through the quarters methodically before the ship was found empty. Families held pieces of their kin in their hands, and every date on every receipt said the same wrong thing. One family received something that didn't belong to their missing relative. The package sat unopened for 2 days. When the deckhand's wife finally cut the tape, she found a brass compass, polished and weighted, nothing like the cheap plastic model her husband carried. The engraving on the back stopped her cold. 3 initials, carved in a careful script, and they belonged to no one on the crew manifest. Not one of the 11 names matched. A clerk ran the initials through harbor records. They resolved to a single man, a sailor logged as lost in these same waters in 1974, the year the current crew members were still children. Someone had boxed up that dead man's instrument and addressed it to a stranger's widow. Compensation claims are exact about dates and numbers, but a recovered personal effect carries other evidence. The 1974 disappearance shared an identical detail. One coincidental echo can be written off. Maritime incident reports showed it was not one. Cross-referencing the region over 50 years pulled up 3 other vanishings. Each followed the same shape: small crews, never more than 5, all within sight of the unmarked atoll. All vessels later found operational, engines warm, and completely empty. Investigators noted something else in the margins: different decades, different vessels, different sailors, yet every single case sat inside the same narrow band on the calendar. They stopped calling it coincidence. Each incident occurred during the same phase of the lunar cycle. Astronomical records settled the question. All 4 disappearances fell within 48 hours of a new moon in March, spread across 5 decades like a schedule nobody had written down. Tidal data from those windows shows something the models cannot explain: extreme current shifts, marked and violent, well beyond what standard oceanographic equations predict for those dates and coordinates. The strongest currents in the known sailing season never behaved this way, and no storm front approached. The ocean moved in a way the science has no name for: on schedule. Sailors who worked these waters had long ago stopped asking why. Local fishermen from the nearest inhabited island had a name for those nights. The fishermen spoke in fragments, and only after long silences. Their grandfathers had a word for the atoll that the young men refused to say out loud, a word that meant forbidden water. Since before memory, the rule was simple: never sail within sight of it during the new moon. When they finally talked, they described the water that pulls, a current no chart showed, running against the tide along the island's flank. They told of lights beneath the surface, slow and cold, moving in formation, as if something down there was keeping watch. They did not call them fish. Question them further, and the elders simply stopped answering, the way a man stops talking about something he has seen and hopes never to see again. One of them made the sign of a cross over water that had never known a church. Then he walked away. What they knew, they would not say. What they feared, they had passed down in silence until it became habit. A researcher who ignored the warnings in 1989 returned with footage. That researcher was a marine biologist, alone on a small research vessel working the current lines. The tape he sent home had been shot in 12 minutes of murky water, and almost nothing in it should have been there. He had found the structures by accident, following a sonar return that had no business being in that depth. The recovery videos show light gathering in pulses, geometric and deliberate, arranged in straight rows that held their shape against the current. They blink in sequence, left to right, the way a message might, the way nothing in the ocean does. The patterns concentrate near low silhouettes on the floor, structures that are square, where stone should be round. His boat was found drifting 2 weeks later, engine running, half a meal on the table. The logbook ended mid-sentence. No storm noted, no distress call, nothing. The tape sat in an evidence box for years. Nobody could identify the species in the footage, because there were no species in the footage, only light and geometry and repetition. The structures in his footage matched something salvage divers found near the missing ship. A commercial salvage team went down to inspect the hull of the missing ship, contracted by insurers who wanted answers. They found the wreckage where it had drifted, but they did not find what they were looking for on it. Below the vessel's drift path, at 200 feet, the seafloor was not supposed to be there. The formations rose like steps carved into the rock, symmetrical in a way underwater geology never is. Edges straight enough to have been measured. Every surface bore carvings, lines cut deep and regular, rows that ran for yards before the light gave out. The team leader logged it as a rock formation and told the surface crew they were coming up. They surfaced early, and none of them would stand near the rail afterward. Each filed the same equipment report, same pressure anomalies, same phrase about readings the instruments could not hold. The contract was voided 3 days later. Nobody put it back on paper. Why? Before the last diver climbed the line, he pressed a wax tablet against one of the carvings and pulled it away. He did not tell the others for a week. One diver took a rubbing of the carvings before ascending. The rubbing took 3 weeks to dry, and every hour of that wait changed what the crew believed about where they were. The symbols matched nothing in any maritime navigation archive. No Polynesian stick chart, no Pacific Island script, none of the known wayfinding marks that had guided canoes across open ocean for 1,000 years. A linguist flew out from Honolulu with a specialty in dead Pacific languages. He turned the sheet sideways, then upside down, and went quiet. The symbols were Proto-Polynesian directional markers, certainly, but inverted, reversed, flipped so that they read backward, the way a warning flare is turned away from the people it is meant to reach. Every marker that would normally point towards safe passage instead steered a traveler outward, away from the atoll, as if the carvings were not meant to guide anyone in, but to keep everyone out. When the shore team compared the rubbing to the wreckage log, one entry stopped the room. The same symbols appeared in the captain's ransacked cabin. Paper survives poorly in salt air, but the forensic team managed to lift torn fragments from under a corroded cabinet in the abandoned cabin. They were map scraps, and on the reverse side of every one, drawn small and precise, was a familiar set of symbols, the same inverted markers, sketched by the captain's own hand. Beneath the drawing sat a set of coordinates, written once, then underlined so hard the pen had scored through the paper. The position resolved to a single point in open water. It was the atoll, the exact center of the lagoon, the same place the divers had surfaced from hours earlier. Near the margin, one word had been written and then rewritten until the ink bled together. Threshold, threshold, threshold. 3 times, each deeper than the last, as if the captain had been working out something he did not want to believe. The crew stood reading it in silence, the low tide hissing against the hull. Somewhere in the same crate, filed behind the maps, sat the personnel record that ended the search. The replacement deckhand's real identity was finally uncovered. The name on the manifest never matched the man in the photographs. A background check turned up a former oceanographer discharged from a state research institute after repeated unauthorized dives near the atoll. Dives he had logged without permission, against direct orders, in weather that had grounded every other vessel on the coast. His published papers described the region as a geomagnetic anomaly zone, a place where local fields bend compass needles and push against the brain's own electrical activity. He had documented crews going quiet, growing forgetful, losing track of time, the longer they stayed near the reef. He wrote that navigation errors in the area were not accidents, that instruments drifted there for a reason, that the anomaly did not just mislead a compass, it misled a mind. Reviewers called the work speculative. The Institute struck it from the archive. His final published paper contained a warning no one took seriously. The paper's conclusion read like something from a field that didn't quite exist yet. It described what he called compulsive approach behavior, a neurological pull toward the source that grew stronger the longer a subject stayed inside the anomaly zone. Peer reviewers called it pseudoscience. One wrote that the study's own data contradicted its thesis. The Institute distanced itself within weeks, and the work faded the way inconvenient findings do. But buried in an appendix, in a single dry sentence, he noted something else. Subjects who displayed the behavior showed measurable changes in cortisol and sleep architecture, physical signatures that predated any exposure. The crew's medical records showed something unusual in their final health check. Their pre-voyage physicals were routine on the surface, but stacked against each other, the 4 files told a different story. Elevated cortisol in all 4. Sleep abnormalities in every recorded cycle. Each of those 4 men had sailed near the region on prior contracts. None of them had mentioned it in their medical histories. Their reports described the same recurring dreams, deep water, and voices coming from somewhere below it. The doctor who signed the forms later said he flagged it as stress, the usual merchant marine fatigue. Nothing about the dreams made it into the official record. One crew member had sent a message home the night before they vanished. The text came through at 2:47 a.m., and the spouse kept a screenshot of it. "We're going somewhere we shouldn't," it read. "I can't explain why I want to." There was no follow-up, no second message, no reply in the logs. At 3:01, 14 minutes after that message left the phone, the ship's GPS showed a course correction. Not a small one, a sharp turn toward open water, away from every plotted waypoint on the intended route. The captain never logged the change. No one radioed it in. The official report called it an unexplained deviation, which was their way of saying no human hand made sense of it. The autopilot data revealed the final course change wasn't made by the captain. The navigation logs placed that final course adjustment at the helm, keyed in by hand. A local override, the system called it, meaning the command originated on the ship itself. But the bridge camera time-stamped 3:04 a.m., and the room shows no one standing there. Every other parameter on that console matched the captain's routing pattern exactly. The turn obeyed the same standard procedure he'd used on every crossing before this one. Whoever input it knew precisely how he worked. Investigators checked the duty roster twice. No crew member was scheduled anywhere near the bridge for another 4 hours. The helm sat empty, while the ship turned toward whatever waited due west. The bridge camera captured something else in the final frames. Enhancement of those last minutes pulls a shape out of the dark behind the console. It moves like a person, arm extended, crossing the frame toward the navigation panel. The timestamp reads 3:04, the same moment the override was entered. Forensic video analysts measured the silhouette against known bridge dimensions. It stands roughly 5'9", they concluded, roughly the captain's own height. But the captain was below deck, asleep, with the watch roster to prove it. The shadow reaches the panel and appears to settle a hand near the heading controls. Then it withdraws, steps back, and is gone from every subsequent frame. No reflection, no source of light in the room to cast it. Audio recovered from the same timestamp changed everything investigators thought they knew. The bridge's ambient microphones reeled in 12 continuous minutes of sound from that night. Beneath the steady rumble of the engine, analysts found a second signal buried in the lower frequencies. A hum, low and rhythmic, pulsing like something breathing. It intensifies slowly across those 12 minutes, climbing from barely audible to clear, then cuts to silence. Right at the moment the ship changed heading, the engineers called it external, directional, non-mechanical. No instrument on the vessel produced it. Triangulation put the source due west, out over open water, miles from any shore. Naval acoustic analysts ran it through every known classification on file. It matched nothing man-made that any Navy would admit to. The hum matched a recording made during one of the earlier disappearances. Somewhere in a government archive sits a reel of Coast Guard tape from 1974, and whatever is on it has been quietly filed away for half a century. The year before the ship at the center of this story went missing, another vessel vanished in the same stretch of water. Search teams pulled its radio logs, and among the routine transmissions, there was a distress call. The caller's voice stayed calm at first, which is what makes what follows harder to listen to. He described his position, then hesitated, and added something nobody filed a follow-up for. He said lights were rising from below the waterline. The transmission ends right there. Running underneath his words, faint but unmistakable, was the same low-frequency hum the acoustic analysts just matched to the earlier disappearance. Whatever made that sound was present in 1974. It was present again the night this ship vanished. Satellite imaging of the atoll taken the day after the ship was found revealed something never seen before. The image is a thermal scan, and it caught a heat signature in the water surrounding the atoll. The effect is roughly circular, about 400 meters wide, and the water temperature sits 12 degrees above the ambient reading. Oceanographers who reviewed the scan have no natural explanation for it. A patch of ocean that contained, should not exist. It should dilute and spread almost immediately. Yet the signature held together like something was still feeding it. Within 48 hours, the reading was gone completely, as if the water had simply closed over whatever was underneath. No volcanic vent, no current, no tidal effect in any dataset produces a footprint like this. The shape is too regular, too deliberate. It looks like something sitting in the water was running hot, and it was sitting there directly beneath where the crew would have been. A fisherman from the nearest island admitted he saw the ship that night. The fisherman is old now, and for days he would not say a word. Investigators kept coming back to his hut until he finally agreed to talk. He watched the ship that night through binoculars from his own boat, well off the atoll, where the water is calm. He describes the vessel lit by a blue glow coming up from below, not from any lamp or flare. The whole hull hung in that light for hours, motionless, not drifting with the current. He said it looked like the ship was being held there. Through the lenses, he could make out figures moving on the deck. One after another, they crossed to the rail, and then each one climbed over it. He counted them as best he could, watching the dark shapes against the blue. He swears the figures went into the water willingly. He counted 11 in all, though he'll tell you the number never felt right. 11 figures sliding over the rail, down the hull, into water that was black at the surface and pale blue below. Not one of them wore a life jacket. Not one hesitated at the edge. They moved the way people move when they believe exactly what they're going toward. He watched the shapes descend, arms at their sides, going down as if the surface were the danger and the light beneath was the way home. He stood at the stern, long after the last crown of hair vanished. The engines started a few minutes later. The fishing vessel began to circle, slow and wide, as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming back to the surface. When the Coast Guard reached the coordinates, the water was calm and empty. 11 people had gone in. 11 men and women, no flotation, no struggle. Search teams found no bodies in the water, but they found something else. The search covered 200 square miles, 27 vessels, 2 helicopters, and a crew of divers working in rotating shifts over 6 consecutive days. They brought nets, grapples, and underwater cameras. The sonar swept the floor in tight grid lines and found plenty. Wreckage from older vessels, shipping containers, unknown structures that drew the dive teams down, but nothing biological. No life jackets, no clothing, no trace of 11 people. On day 4, the divers started coming up wrong. One reported his depth gauge spinning backward. Another surfaced 20 degrees off his planned exit point, insisting he'd been swimming straight the whole time. 2 regulators failed without warning. By day 6, the operation was suspended, officially on safety grounds. The log cited equipment malfunctions and diver disorientation. The recovered haul was hauled and cataloged. Cargo nets, rigging, a single oil drum, nothing that belonged to the crew. The search was called off at dusk and the teams withdrew, but one diver surfaced, insisting he heard voices calling his name. 3 divers went down that week, separate dives, same report. Each one described voices in the water, clear enough to understand, calling them by name and asking them to go deeper. The voices, they said, matched the missing crew. One diver followed for nearly 2 minutes before his training overrode the pull. Another surfaced mid-dive, cutting his own air supply short. A third refused to explain what he heard, only that he would never go back. None of the 3 have dived since. Company medical records show all 3 passed psychological evaluation before the incident. No history of auditory hallucinations, no medication, no head injuries. 2 had logged hundreds of dives in that same water with nothing out of the ordinary. The finding was written up and quietly filed. The divers were given paid leave and reassigned to shore duties. No cause was ever named, which is what made the 3rd page of the captain's log so hard to read that night, because the oceanographer deckhand had written about this exact phenomenon. Infrasound lives below 20 Hz, too low to hear, but it's impossible to ignore once it reaches your body. In a 2003 experiment, scientists hid a 17.5 Hz tone inside a London concert performance, and 22% of the audience reported chills, deep unease, and sorrow, with no idea why. Scans later showed the amygdala, the primal threat center, lighting up, even though the conscious ear never registered anything. The feeling arrives first. The mind catches up later. The deckhand's notes argued this zone puts out exactly that signal, and the effect only sharpens as a vessel draws closer. It would explain the false memories, the hallucinations in the audio, the compulsion to turn the wheel toward empty water. He called it acoustic luring. What looks like a decision, he wrote, is a reflex, a body answering a frequency it cannot name before the mind gets any say. He had also noticed something the lab reports skipped. The readings spiked strongest not in open water, but directly over the submerged structures, as if the stone itself were shaping the wave. He believed the structures were amplifying something that predated them. The first survey crews treated the anomalies as natural geology, ridges and debris left by an older seafloor. Carbon dating changed that. The layers in the core samples came back at least 3,000 years old, older than the port town's oldest recorded settlement, old enough to predate every map anyone kept. But the carvings told a stranger story than the dates. Incised lines in the rock follow arcs no Bronze Age chisel should manage. The cut faces are too clean, the angles too consistent, edges that suggest rotary tooling and measured precision. Metallurgists who examined the grooves refused to commit to a date. The trace elements settled it instead. The samples contain compounds found nowhere else in the region's bedrock, stone that does not belong to this island at all. The oceanographer Deckhand had flagged this once, a margin note barely legible. Something was down there, he wrote, and it hadn't been waiting quietly. He left half a sentence unfinished, and the surveyors never asked him to finish it. A myth from the island matches the structure's layout exactly. 90 years before that crew entered the water, the island elders still told it as a warning, never as a tale. The singers beneath, they called them. Spirits who rise during moonless nights and call sailors into the deep with voices that promise paradise, gardens, rest, and the faces of the dead. The old people said the call didn't sound like a voice at all. It sounded like a name each sailor already knew. Those who answer never surface. But the families never truly lose them either. Days later, the belongings wash ashore, clothing folded as though by careful hands, keepsakes arranged in order, always untouched, always dry at the waterline. An offering left at the sand for someone to find. The pattern in the myth matches the sonar exactly. The elders described the same chambers the survey mapped, doorway for doorway, and nobody in the village had ever laid eyes on those scans. The last lines of the story warn against listening when the water runs flat and the sky is black. The ship's black box contained one final entry no one had accessed. Engine room sensors logged a pressure drop at 3:17 a.m., a sudden, clean fall of the kind you'd expect from multiple hull breaches at once. And yet, the water alarms never fired. No ingress was recorded. Nothing flowed in. Nothing registered against the compartment walls. Then the temperature in the lower decks jumped 8 degrees in under a minute, before drifting back to normal just as quietly. Down there, that corridor sits meters from the waterline. For it to warm like that, with no fire and no steam and no machinery running, the math does not close. Engineers have gone through the logs for years now, and there is no mechanical explanation that fits. The data holds its shape no matter how you read it. The pressure drop coincided with the exact moment the witness saw the crew enter the water. So we line up the 3 records: the sensor spike, the witness on deck, and that low hum caught on the bridge audio. Laid side by side, they fall inside a 90-second window, the span of a single short breath. Whatever happened to that crew, it did not reach them one at a time, man by man down a corridor. It arrived all at once, to every person aboard, in the same minute, 90 seconds, and every log goes quiet in the same way. The significance of that is hard to overstate. A distress call can take minutes to unfold. A fire longer, a drift off course longer still. Here, the whole ship changed in the time it takes to tie a knot. Not long after the investigators finished their first pass of the timeline, a journalist covering the case received an anonymous tip. No name, no number to call back. Just a set of coordinates and a single blank line of instruction. The coordinates led to an atoll 200 miles south of the ship's last known position. It was uninhabited, unmarked on any chart the journalist could find, gone from the navigational publications entirely. Satellite imagery of that patch of water shows something unexpected below the surface. Submerged structures, regular in shape, laid out in a pattern too orderly for coral that grew on its own. The tipster's message held one more detail. There are at least a dozen such sites across the Pacific, they claimed, and every one of them aligned with the rest, as if oriented to a single line. A cartographer eventually pulled the old charts out of storage to check the claim. The alignment matches an ancient Polynesian navigation route, one abandoned in the 14th century. Archaeologists had cataloged it once as a living artery of trade. Palauan canoes, Solomon slate, feather currency, they all moved along it for generations. Thousands of miles of open water, crossed on schedules that held for centuries. Then the fleets stopped arriving. Entire flotillas, crewed by men who knew every current and reef, vanished without a trace, and without a storm to blame. No wreckage ever surfaced. No survivor ever stepped ashore. The oral histories say the navigators who remained called it cursed and did something more permanent. They erased it, cut every star pair and swell pattern from the maps passed down for generations. By the 1400s, the route simply did not exist anymore. 3 more centuries of sailors never spoke of it, and then the age of steam redrew the oceans on paper. Yet modern shipping lanes now avoid those exact areas, and the companies never explain why. Whatever the old navigators knew, the insurers of the 1960s had found their own word for it. Leaked documents from internal maritime underwriting memos flagged the region with the clinical label, Elevated Incident Probability. Premiums on the routes doubled overnight. No circular, no press release, no regulatory note explained the change. Shipping companies got the quiet word and rerouted their vessels, and the industry treated the whole thing as ordinary business. The math only worked because the risk was real. Underwriters do not price twice the premium on a rumor. They price it on bodies and lost cargo, and the actuarial tables nobody outside the firm is allowed to read. For the crew that set out on this voyage, the arithmetic had already been done on them. The employer had insured it for triple the standard amount. The policy itself surfaced years later, buried in a legal archive. 3 weeks before departure, the company took out a loss policy at a value that made no sense for a routine cargo run. Its own clauses list what was covered: total loss of crew, abandonment of the vessel, and then a line written broadly enough to almost laugh at its own vagueness: unexplained circumstances. Every word of that category triggers a full payout. When the ship failed to return, they submitted the claim and collected in full. No investigation demanded, no salvage looked for, no questions asked by the underwriters. The money sat in the company accounts within months. If anyone on the board had doubted the decision, there was one quiet name on the final approval. A company executive had sailed the route himself 2 years earlier. The same board that approved the decision had a file they never opened in the meeting room. Employment records show the operations director captained a vessel through that corridor in 1996, 14 years before the crew disappeared. His ship logged what he called minor navigational anomalies, compass readings that shifted a few degrees at a time, instruments briefly refusing their own numbers. He filed a report afterward, recommending the route be flagged and charted with a warning. The company filed it away. Nothing marked the corridor on any public map, and his name stayed off the paperwork that mattered. Colleagues who sat near his office say he never once repeated the recommendation, as if the submission itself had used up whatever push he had left. He resigned 1 month after the crew vanished. The resignation created more questions than it answered. He left no forwarding address, no phone number, and stopped taking maritime work entirely. His license expired unrenewed, a detail that takes effort for a captain who spent 30 years at sea. Former colleagues described him as shaken, though no one could say exactly by what. Asked about the 1996 voyage, he went quiet, and the silence lasted whole minutes while the room waited. Calls went unanswered. Interview requests were declined in 2 sentences or not at all. There was no scandal tied to his name, no lawsuit, nothing that would explain a man walking away from the only profession he had ever known. People who knew him say he simply stopped talking about the water. The families of the missing crew filed suit, but the case never went to trial. What the families wanted was answers, not money. What they got was a settlement for an undisclosed sum wrapped in a strict non-disclosure clause that bound every party who touched the paperwork. Legal observers who reviewed the terms said the figure sat substantially higher than standard maritime loss cases, well above what insurance usually pays for a vanished ship. That gap mattered. A payout that large tends to mean the company wanted the case closed more than they wanted it cheap, and the NDA meant no one could say why. All parties signed, the families, the lawyers, the company, every name on the last page. 2 weeks after the ink dried, the company sold the vessel at auction under a false name, a registry change, so that the ship's real identity appeared nowhere in the listing. The ship itself was sold at auction under a false name. The new owners repainted the hull a dull, functional gray. They filed a name change, a registry swap, and moved the vessel east. Shipping records show her changing hands 3 times in 6 months. Each buyer sold her at a loss, which is not how scrap trading usually works. Nobody on paper wanted to hold her. By 2001, the hull sat in a Southeast Asian breaking yard, propped in a slipway with her guts being cut out from the inside. The torch crews worked for weeks. Partway through, they stopped. Workers at the scrapyard reported finding something welded inside the hull. Below the waterline, sealed behind a plate that appeared on no blueprint, sat a compartment the breakers had to force open. Inside, seawater had done its work. Waterlogged papers, a handheld sonar unit caked in salt, and a journal. The cover read the deckhand's name, the man who had signed on the day before the voyage. Most of the pages had fused into a solid, unreadable block, but the sonar device still held its memory card, and the journal's final entries had survived the damp better than the rest. One entry was preserved well enough to read. It was dated March 3rd, the day before the ship left port. The handwriting is steadier than you'd expect. He wrote, "They don't take you. You go because you finally understand what's down there." The pull isn't force, it's clarity. I was wrong to resist it before. He underlined the last line twice. For the breaker crew, that was the end of it. They filed the find away, sold the electronics, and moved on. But the sonar device contained stored data from a dive he made years earlier. The device had kept its own logbook. Buried in that memory was a single dive, recorded back in 1991, when someone had taken it down to 600 feet, just off the atoll. That part was straightforward. What it imaged on the way down was not. The sonar returned a picture of the seabed, and beneath the structures it revealed a cavity. Not a pocket or a fissure, a hollow space roughly 2 kilometers across, and so deep the instrument's range simply ran out before it found the bottom. 600 feet of water over a void that could not be measured. Every contour in the imaging had a regularity to it, straight edges, even spacing, the kind of geometry that natural erosion does not usually produce. Whatever the scanning was looking at, it was not reading as a cave. The sonar kept recording the void the way it recorded a wall. A solid boundary, then emptiness behind it. Marine geologists have no explanation for how such a cavity could exist without collapsing. At that depth, the water column presses down on every surface with thousands of pounds per square inch. Any hollow structure, no matter how strong when it formed, should have crumpled within centuries. Instead, this cavity has survived for millennia. The math is unforgiving. Sediment fills these spaces. Rock shifts. Roofs fall. Every known geological process spells the same outcome: and the void refuses to follow it. Conventional geology has no model for what keeps the cavity intact, and the older it gets, the fewer answers remain. One researcher committed the theory to paper. The cavity exists, he argued, because something is holding it open. He called it maintenance by active means, then offered no mechanism and named no force that could do the work. Nothing in the natural world performs that kind of labor at this depth. Nothing geology has a name for resists pressure that way. The walls have no business standing, and yet they stand anyway. Then the thread pulls tighter. A deep-sea research mission to the site was proposed in 2003 and immediately classified. So the researchers filed Freedom of Information requests. What came back was not an explanation, and not even a denial. It was a single line, citing national security grounds, refusing to confirm the request, the mission, or the site even existed. The courts know this move well. In the 1970s, a CIA salvage ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, was hiding a classified operation to raise a sunken Soviet submarine, and when a reporter asked about it, the agency found it could answer with nothing at all. No file, no name, no coordinates. The refusal became doctrine. Agencies still invoke it today, and they are free to invoke it here. And then the paperwork itself went dark. Satellite imagery of that region, for the exact months around the mission, was pulled from the public archives. Redaction strips over open water, coordinates that simply stopped being recorded. The mission left classified in 2003, still classified decades later, with no reason given and nothing to appeal. A submariner who worked the mission spoke anonymously years later. He described the descent the way you'd describe a slow fall. At around 800 feet, the instruments stopped behaving, and the hull began to sing with metallic readings that no natural formation should produce. Then came the organized acoustic patterns, rhythmic, repeating, not the random chatter of a reef or a current, but something that sounded like it was responding to the ship's own sonar ping. The mission was aborted at 800 feet. Everyone on board was debriefed, then bound by secrecy agreements that carried no expiration date and no appeal. The government quietly established an exclusion zone around the atoll the following year. Pull up a nautical chart of that region today, and you'll find the atoll marked as restricted for environmental research. No public access, no commercial traffic, no explanation printed anywhere on the map. Enforcement is silent. Ships that drift too close are simply rerouted, given coordinates that take them miles away, and told nothing more. The restriction has stayed in place ever since. Decades have passed, and the zone has never been lifted. No research was ever published under that environmental label. No findings released. No data shared with any scientific body. Families of the missing still search for answers. Every year on the same date, the relatives gather. No ceremony, no speeches, just an organized group of people who walk the same shoreline, holding the same photographs. They've built an advocacy organization that pushes for declassification of the government records. Most have quietly accepted their loved ones are gone. A few still hold on to the belief that one day they'll return. The search continues, and the urge to know outweighs the cost of asking.